Most people think the Roman Empire fell because of barbarian invasions, but the truth is far more complicated. Rome wasn't destroyed overnight. It collapsed from the inside out, a slow unraveling of politics, economics, and climate that finally brought the greatest empire of the ancient world to its knees. Today, we'll uncover the real reasons the Roman Empire fell. Rome suffered from constant civil wars, assassinations, and power struggles. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Between 235 and 285 AD, Rome saw more than 20 emperors in just 50 years. This chaos weakened central authority and left the empire vulnerable. To pay for endless wars and luxury, Rome heavily taxed its citizens and devalued its currency. Inflation soared, trade slowed, and ordinary Romans grew poorer. By the 3rd century, the empire's economy was on the verge of collapse. At its height, Rome stretched from Britain to the Middle East. But maintaining such a vast territory was impossible. Troops were spread thin, supply lines were overstretched, and defending the borders became a constant drain on resources. Troops were spread thin, supply lines were overstretched, and defending the borders became a constant drain on resources. The story of Rome's fall is often painted as a simple one. Waves of savage hordes crashing against the frontiers, overwhelming a civilized empire. But the reality was far more complex and, in many ways, more intimate. The term barbarian itself was a Roman catch-all for anyone outside their Greco-Roman world, not necessarily a judgment of their sophistication. For centuries, the relationship between Rome and these external groups was one of constant negotiation, trade, and conflict. It wasn't just about invasions. Many Germanic tribes were actually settled inside Roman borders as allies. This policy created a class of allies known as, in exchange for land within the empire's provinces and a subsidy, these tribes pledged to defend the frontier and serve in the Roman army. On the surface, it was a pragmatic solution to Rome's chronic manpower shortages. It outsourced border defense and integrated potential threats. But it was a double-edged sword. This strategy effectively stationed large, autonomous, and heavily armed non-Roman populations within the state itself. For a time, the system held, a fragile symbiosis born of mutual need. The Romans needed soldiers, and the tribes needed security and land. But the balance began to tip as Rome weakened from within. Decades of political instability, civil wars, and a cratering economy meant the central government could no longer reliably pay its troops or its allies. Promises were broken. Subsidies dried up. Worse, Roman corruption and arrogance often turned allies into enemies. A catastrophic example occurred in 376 AD, when the Goths, fleeing the advancing Huns, were allowed to cross the Danube into Roman territory. Instead of being provisioned as promised, they were brutally exploited and starved by local Roman commanders. Their desperation exploded into open revolt, culminating in the Battle of Adrianople. Here, the Gothic heavy cavalry shattered the imperial legions and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens himself. It was a devastating military and psychological blow from which Rome would never fully recover. It proved that the barbarians within the gates were now more powerful than the legions meant to control them. This pivotal moment emboldened other groups. The Visigothic leader Alaric, after years of frustrated negotiations for titles and land, marched his army on the heart of the empire, sacking the city of Rome in 410. While shocking, Alaric's goal wasn't to destroy the city, but to force the emperor's hand. This event set a precedent. Other groups saw that Roman authority was hollow. The Vandals, under their cunning king Gaiseric, embarked on an even more audacious path. They swept across Gaul and Spain, crossed into North Africa, and in 439, captured the city of Carthage. This was a mortal wound. By seizing Rome's wealthiest province, the Vandals cut off the vital grain supply to Italy, and established their own powerful maritime kingdom, eventually sacking Rome themselves in 455. Finally, there were the Ostrogoths. Their leader, Theodoric the Great, was a fascinating figure who had spent his youth as a noble hostage in Constantinople, giving him a deep understanding of Roman politics and culture. He was commissioned by the Eastern Roman Emperor to overthrow the Germanic chieftain who had deposed the last Western Emperor. After succeeding, Theodoric established his own Ostrogothic kingdom in Italy, ruling from Ravenna. He governed as a dual ruler, a king to his Goths and a patrician to his Roman subjects, attempting to fuse the two cultures. Thus, the Western Roman Empire wasn't simply conquered, it transformed. The Foederati, once the empire's defenders, became its successors. as central authority crumbled, these groups, the Visigoths, Vandals, Franks, and Ostrogoths, turned against a state that could no longer sustain its part of the bargain. They stopped being cogs in the Roman machine and instead took over the machine itself, carving out the kingdoms that would eventually form the map of medieval Europe. While barbarian invasions and political corruption often steal the spotlight, two silent and invisible forces were just as responsible for crippling the Roman Empire: climate change and pandemic disease. For centuries, Rome had flourished during a period of warm, stable weather known as the Roman climate optimum. This predictability was the bedrock of its agricultural economy, allowing it to feed its massive cities and sprawling armies. But this golden era was not to last. New research in paleoclimatology, using evidence from tree rings, ice cores, and lake sediments, reveals a dramatic shift. Beginning around 250 AD, the empire entered a period of climatic instability, sometimes called the Late Roman Little Ice Age. Temperatures dropped and weather patterns became erratic. What followed were decades of unpredictable harvests, severe droughts in some regions, and unseasonable floods in others. Agriculture, the engine of the Roman state, began to sputter and fail. This agricultural crisis had cascading consequences. Widespread food shortages led to famine and malnutrition, not just in the countryside, but in the heart of Rome itself. The price of grain skyrocketed, sparking social unrest and riots among the hungry populace. For the state, the impact was catastrophic. With farms failing, the tax base evaporated, leaving the government starved of the revenue needed to pay soldiers, maintain infrastructure, and administer its vast territories. The empire's body was being weakened from within, making it dangerously susceptible to the next great crisis. And that crisis arrived in the form of pestilence. A malnourished population is a vulnerable one, and Rome's interconnected trade routes, once a source of strength, now became highways for disease. The first major blow was the Antonine Plague in the 2nd century, but it was the plague of Cyprian, beginning around 249 AD, that struck during this period of climate-induced weakness. Named after the bishop of Carthage who chronicled its horrors, the disease was terrifying. Cyprian described unending vomiting, fever, and a putrefying of the limbs. At its peak, the plague was said to claim 5,000 lives a day in the city of Rome alone. The demographic collapse was staggering. Entire towns and villages were wiped out. This created a severe manpower crisis that crippled the empire on two fronts. There were not enough farmers to work the fields, compounding the existing food shortages. And critically, there were not enough able-bodied men to fill the ranks of the legions. Rome's ability to defend its borders was fatally undermined. The plague also triggered a profound crisis of faith. The traditional Roman gods seemed powerless, and many turned to new religions for solace. The Christian community, in particular, gained followers for its willingness to care for the sick and dying, even at great personal risk. Together, climate change and plague formed a perfect storm. The changing climate weakened the empire's agricultural and economic foundations, and the pandemic shattered its demographic base. It was a one-two punch that left the once mighty Roman Empire hollowed out, fragile, and exposed to the enemies gathering at its gates. So, while the image of barbarian hordes sacking the Eternal City is the one etched in our collective memory, it was merely the final dramatic act in a long, slow-motion collapse. The real fall of Rome wasn't a single event, but a cascade of failures, a perfect storm of internal decay that had been brewing for centuries. The barbarian invasions were the final blow, but the empire was already a hollowed-out shell. Politically, the rot began at the very top. The once revered Senate became a rubber stamp for increasingly erratic emperors. The Praetorian Guard, meant to protect the emperor, instead became kingmakers, assassinating rulers, and auctioning the throne to the highest bidder. This systemic corruption bled out into the provinces, where governors plundered local economies, creating a populace that felt more exploited than protected. Economically, the empire was a house of cards. When the borders stopped expanding, the flow of new wealth dried up. To pay for its massive army, emperors debased the currency, triggering runaway inflation that made savings worthless and trade chaotic. Militarily, Rome was a victim of its own success. This concept of imperial overstretch meant legions were spread thin across thousands of miles of frontier. To plug the gaps, Rome began hiring mercenaries from the very barbarian tribes it sought to keep out. These foederati had little loyalty to the abstract idea of Rome. Their allegiance was to their paymasters and their own chieftains. The Roman army was slowly ceasing to be Roman, and beneath it all, the very ground was shifting. Historians and climate scientists now point to the end of the Roman climate optimum. A period of climatic instability, sometimes called the Late Antique Little Ice Age, brought colder, wetter weather. This led to unpredictable harvests, widespread famine, and the spread of disease, weakening the population and straining the empire's resources to the breaking point. This brings us to the great debate. Was Rome's fall inevitable? Was it a civilization doomed by its own internal contradictions, its reliance on expansion, its autocratic rule, its economic fragility? Or could it have been saved? Imagine if the stable leadership of the 5 good emperors had become the norm. What if Diocletian's radical reforms to divide the empire had been more successfully implemented? What if Rome had found a way to peacefully integrate migrating peoples as allies, rather than antagonizing them, as they disastrously did with the Goths before the Battle of Adrianople? The answer is lost to time, but the question is more relevant than ever. What do you think? Was Rome doomed from the start? A magnificent but flawed machine destined to break down? Or could it have survived with better leadership and different choices? Share your theories and arguments in the comments below. Let's get a real historical debate going. The story of Rome is a powerful echo from the past, a profound lesson in the fragility of even the mightiest civilizations. If you want to continue exploring these echoes and uncovering the lessons they hold for our own time, then join our community of history explorers. Like this video if it gave you a new perspective, share it with a friend who loves ancient history, and be sure to subscribe to Echoes of Time and ring that notification bell. That way, you'll never miss our next expedition into the untold stories and ancient mysteries that shaped our world.